Good morning. Our sacred story this morning, which frankly seems a little redundant after hearing Marg's talk, is from Exodus chapter 1, verses 15 through chapter 2, verses 10. The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah and the other Puah, "When you act as midwives to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it is a boy, kill him. If it is a girl, she shall live." But the midwives feared God. They did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but they let the boys live. So the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and said to them, "Why have you done this and allowed the boys to live?" The midwives said to the Pharaoh, "Because the Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife comes to them." So God dealt with the midwives. God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and became very strong. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families. Then Pharaoh commanded all his people, "Every boy that is born to the Hebrews you shall throw into the Nile, but you shall let every girl live." Now a man from the house of Levi went and married a Levite woman. The woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw that he was a fine baby, she hid him 3 months. When she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him and plastered it with bitumen and pitch. She put the child in it and placed it among the reeds on the bank of the river. His sister stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. The daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river, while her attendants walked beside the river. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her maid to bring it. When she opened it, she saw the child. He was crying, and she took pity on him. "This must be one of the Hebrews' children," she said. Then his sister said to the Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and get you a nurse from the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you?" Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Yes." So the girl went and called the child's mother. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child and nurse it for me, and I will give you your wages." So the woman took the child and nursed it. When the child grew up, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and she took him as her son. She named him Moses because she said, "I drew him out of the water." This is the sacred story of God and God's people. May the still speaking God speak to us this day. Thanks be to God.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Devorah. So first, I just want to thank Daryl for inviting me to come and speak this morning. Right after I had begun in San Diego, I was a new rabbi in town. It was 3.5 years ago now. And this guy came to my Torah study, and he knew a little too much. And I thought, there's something up with this cat. And then it turned out to be Daryl, and he was a minister, and so of course he knew too much. So it was great, and that began a wonderful friendship that my husband and I are truly grateful for with Daryl and with Sasha. So thank you for inviting me. So I wanted to speak this morning. We titled my talk, "The Conspiracy of Women," which should be followed with, everyone join me, dun dun dun. Yeah, it's going to be interactive. So I want to bring us, we heard a wonderful interpretation from our wonderful teacher, and we just heard the word from the book. And so I want to go into a few of the details. We're going to explore this text this morning. There was a time when, for many years, really for, we know, at least a few generations, we think just because of the population increase, that the Israelites who had come down to Egypt in the time of the famine under Joseph, that the Israelites were living in Egypt side by side as peaceful neighbors and co-nationalists in the land of Egypt. And of course, how did our people wind up? How did my people wind up living in Goshen as neighbors to the Egyptians? It was because there were some not nice brothers who did what siblings do, which is, sell their sibling into slavery. I thought about it, and if I had seen a passing caravan, my brother might not be with us today. So Joseph winds up as a slave in Egypt, and of course we know this wonderful story. You can go rent the Prince, which one is the the Prince of Egypt tells it. It's a really good story that leads to all of this. But Joseph and the Technicolor Dreamcoat with Donny Osmond. It's a lot of fun. Good family film. So Joseph winds up in Egypt. The two stories meet, so it's musicals back to back. Joseph winds up in Egypt and becomes a vizier for Pharaoh. And of course, he's the one who's able, by God's help, to correctly interpret Pharaoh's dream. He predicts this terrible famine that's going to come. And then he helps Egypt create and capitalize on a plan of rationing so that they can save during the years of plenty in order to have and actually increase in wealth in the years of famine. And this is what happens. And so Pharaoh and Joseph are wonderful working partners, and Joseph's entire family is invited by that Pharaoh to come down and to live as their neighbors and friends in the land, in the region of Goshen in Egypt, in ancient Egypt. And so they do. And Torah tells us they stayed there and multiplied. And it was a nice relationship until, and this is the big until there arose a Pharaoh who knew not Joseph. We know this text, right? Until there arose a Pharaoh who knew not Joseph. I want us to imagine the magnitude of this ignorance. A man rose to the highest seat in office who did not know the basics of his own country's history, of his own country's legacy, and how these people who were others, but who had been others for a really long time, and neighbors, were in his land. And he looked at them with dread and with fear, which of course morphed into irrational hatred. He looked at them and despised them. It is very important for leaders of countries to know their history. That's just a little side note. Interpret that as you will. And so, based on his fear, not based on empirical evidence, not based on case history, not based on any actual circumstances of anything that had ever occurred, he decides, what does he say in Torah? He says in Exodus, these people, if someone comes to attack us from the outside, they may be an enemy within. They might want to destroy us, and they will rise up and join with our enemy and work to crush and destroy Egypt. Now, these people were faithful and loyal citizens. They had been living there peacefully and happily for many generations. And so, based on his own irrational fears, he then subjugates them to slavery, a terrible case of oppression, which they enter into willingly because of their belief that they're loyal citizens. If the Pharaoh needs them to start building treasure cities, okay, we'll build treasure cities. We don't like it, but we'll do it. If Pharaoh then tells them you need to make your own bricks, okay, we'll make our own bricks. We don't love it, but we'll do it. Because of their love for their country. And then the conscription became oppression, and the conscription became slavery. And before they knew it, they were enslaved. But then, because Pharaoh was acting not on actuality, but on paranoia, on a reality that exists in his own mind, he still fears this population that he has subjugated and enslaved. And so what does he do? He goes to these midwives, Shiphrah and Puah, as we just heard read. He goes to Shiphrah and Puah. Now, the really cool thing about Shiphrah and Puah is the text is intentionally ambiguous. It says that they are midwives to the Hebrew women. They could have been Israelites, so Israelites to Israelite women, but they might also have been Egyptians. And I believe that the text leaves it open so that we can imagine either scenario. On the one hand, it's easy to imagine, well, if someone's coming after my people, of course I'm going to defend them. But the text doesn't say that they were Israelite women. What if they were Egyptian women? What if they were just lovely Egyptian women who had dedicated their lives to serving as midwives, to helping bring life into this world safely for the moms and safely for the babies? And they refused to participate in Pharaoh's decree of destruction. Now, I want to say that Pharaoh was probably very flawed from the start in this, because if you're going to kill babies, going to midwives and asking them to help is not the right audience. You've missed your target audience for partnership. Just saying. You got to play to your strengths. So he targets these midwives, asks them to do everything that they stand in opposition to. And it's obviously supposed to be done in secret. Because what are they supposed to do? They're supposed to look at the baby as it comes out of the body, and if it's a boy, smother and destroy it. And say, oh, it was a stillbirth. What can we do? And if it's a girl, let it live. Now here's where Shifra and Puah are profoundly courageous and brilliant women. Because what do? They don't participate. They refuse. They deliver these babies and let them live. And Pharaoh summons them for an interrogation and says, what is this thing that you have done? Why are all these women giving birth to these babies that are living? And they use Pharaoh's own prejudice as a way. They use his already existing blindness to blind him further. They say, oh, these Israelites, they're not real people. They're not human beings. The Hebrew text actually says, this was a lovely translation that you read. It was a nice translation. The text actually says, not that they're vigorous, but that they're like animals. They're like animals who just, we've seen National Geographic and giraffes. They just squat in the field and out pops a baby, and then the baby's up and going. They use Pharaoh's own prejudice against him. They liken the Israelite women to animals. I want us to understand how brilliant this is, because they don't say, oh, my camel got sick, I didn't get there in time. Oh, my cart broke, the axle was terrible. Oh, I fell and I stubbed my toe, I broke it, I couldn't get there in time. They weren't perpetually late. Instead, they created an excuse that allowed every other midwife who would want to participate in this vital civil disobedience to join with them. So not only did they create protection for themselves, but they created a blanket of protection for all other women who refused to participate in the murder of children. And that is profound. I want to underscore how profound it is, because Torah tells us specifically that God dealt well with the midwives and preserved their name in the house of Israel. So women, especially who don't get to inherit property, they each have a house named for them in the land of Israel. In other words, they have merited the right to inherit their own property and to have a place always and forever in our future because of how they saved lives and made it possible for other people to save lives. Now we see after the story of Shifra and Puah that things actually get worse, because Pharaoh at this point is so immersed in his own reality in his head that he creates a program where he's just done with the facade and he just starts killing the babies openly. And we know this because now suddenly it's not safe. So after Yocheved, Moses' mother, gives birth, what does the text tell us? That she had to keep the baby hidden and kept him hidden for 3 months until she could hide him no longer. And so she goes and she creates this little floating boat. I want us to appreciate the magnitude of fear that leads a parent to feel that a caulked basket on a river is a safer option than their home. Right? Several summers ago, there were all of these children who were coming up from Central America on train roofs and who had been given over by their parents to human smugglers. And never in the conversation did anyone point this out. How much fear must there be in the heart of a parent to entrust the most precious thing in their lives to the worst elements of human society and nature? The day you decide that human smugglers are safer for your children than staying at home is the day that the world needs to respond with love and kindness. Because how many of us would willingly throw our kids into a basket on a river? How many of us are even comfortable with our kids going to a swim party? Even if there's a lifeguard. This is the level of fear that this mother is living with. And we know that this is the level of fear that so many mothers and fathers around the world today are living with. I want us to imagine the fear of the hearts of every refugee who has gotten into some rickety raft somewhere off the coast of the eastern coast of the Mediterranean and allowed that to be the way to leave. That meant that that raft and the likelihood of drowning were safer options than staying in Aleppo or staying anywhere else in Syria or staying in the country that used to be Iraq and facing ISIS. That's what leads these people onto these rafts. It's not because they're trying to get a free ride anywhere. It's because facing drowning on the Mediterranean is the safer of their options. Because no parent willingly endangers the life of their child like that, capriciously. So this mother Yocheved takes her baby and places him in the basket with prayers and sends him off. And here is where we see the hand of God. Where does God's hand come in? In delivering the basket safely over to Bat Paro, a woman with a good heart, in spite of who her father was. Delivering the basket safely to Bat Paro, to the daughter of Pharaoh, who opens the basket and says, "It's one of those little Hebrew babies." There's a lot of speculation how she knew that it was a Hebrew baby. One answer is possibly circumcision, but we know that the Egyptians at different points in their history also practiced circumcision, so it may not have been just the circumcision. I like to say it was that he was a gingy, as they say in Israel. He was a redhead because Jews and Scots are the only two genetic groups that produce redheaded children, so assuming his ancestry wasn't Scottish because they hadn't made it that far south yet, yeah, so I like to think Moses was a little redheaded, gingy baby. And so he opens the basket, it's one of those little redheaded Hebrew kids, how cute. And then imagine this, Miriam, who watched her mother do this, little Miriam, goes running along the river and then has the courage to walk up to Bat Paro and say, "Hey, I noticed you just found a baby in the river. If you'd like, I could go get a Hebrew woman to be the nursemaid, to be the milk nurse." And Pharaoh's daughter says, "Sure, go ahead and get her," knowing full well that this girl is bringing the mother back to the baby. So Yocheved comes to Bat Paro, and Bat Paro says, "Here, would you mind taking this baby that I have just adopted and found and adopted, and nursing him for me, and I'll pay you wages." So not only does she restore the baby to the mother, but she then makes sure that she is financially sustained so that she can protect her child and that she has royal protection from that. She says, "Then when he's older, bring him back and I'll raise him as a prince." And so a family is reunited. Bat Paro sustains them economically. And then, of course, Moses is raised in the palace so that he can have the courage and the knowledge how to oppose Pharaoh in the future. This is a profound conspiracy of 5 courageous women. They're not women who necessarily would have defined themselves as feminists. They're not women who would have necessarily defined themselves as leaders of a revolution and a rebellion. Instead, they were 5 women who were faced with profound injustice. And in the face of that profound injustice, do what we all must do and respond with kindness, with empathy, and as God's agents in this world, offering the same protection and love that we know that Jesus and the prophets would be offering if they themselves were here. Because that is what it means to be in sacred covenant with God. It means to be God's hands on this earth so that others may know God's love by us and our words and our actions. And that's exactly what these 5 courageous women did. They could go scream at Pharaoh all day long and it wouldn't have made a difference. And we ourselves know this frustration when we yell at the halls of power and our pleas for decency and kindness land on deaf ears. And so instead, they focused on what they could, and they affected what they could. They said, "You can enact whatever policies you want, but it will not take place in my circle. It will not take place in my house. I will not allow you to bring evil into a place in which God resides." When we look at the statistics from World War II, one of the things that we see is the difference between countries that complied happily with Hitler and the countries that resisted him. And my favorite example of this is France. Good old France. France, who I simultaneously love and love to hate. Not hate, that's a mean word, but be irritated with. In the north of France, the Vichy government, they happily complied with Hitler's edicts to transport all of their Jews. And in the south, what did the southern French do in the region of Gaul? The region, by the way, where Mary Magdalene went. This was her region. These are her people. So what happened in the south of France? In the north of France, they put all their Jews on trains and sent them to their deaths. And in the south of France, what did they do? They put all their Jews in their basements and kept them safe and protected until the war was over. When you look at the statistics from France, 90% of the Jews in France who died in the camps were from northern France, and only 10% were from southern France. Because southern France made the choice to not participate in an edict of evil. They made the choice to see the people who others would describe as enemies within, as strangers in our own land, as people who are to be mistrusted and despised. They saw them for who they were, which were fellow people of God and human beings. And so they loved them, and they protected them. And because of that, southern France does not carry to this day the same burden of shame that northern France carries. My own family was saved by their neighbors in southern France. They were kept by their neighbors on their farms, in their basements. They were fed, they were clothed, and the men all fought together in the French partisan troops in the forest against the Nazis together. That is a legacy to be proud of. That is the legacy of these 5 women. I use these 2 examples because I want us to understand this conspiracy of women is a roadmap for all of us. So many of us feel so powerless to know how to affect positive change. And I promise you that there were no people more powerless in Pharaoh's regime than these women. First of all, they were women, which automatically puts them in the bottom 50% of the population in the power's hierarchy. Second of all, more than half of them were Hebrew women, or at least 2/5 of them were Hebrew women. Possibly 2/5 Hebrew, possibly Egyptian, and 1 Egyptian woman. But those labels didn't matter. Instead, they saw each other as partners in resistance. So my invitation for us this morning is to be inspired by these women and to recognize that we live in a world right now where we are too comfortable labeling people as other, and where many people who exist on the fringe of society and who are minorities within our own country are being scapegoated. Not for who they are, but for who some suspect they might be. Not based on empirical evidence, but based on irrational fears. We will either stand up and protect them, as these 5 women did, or we will quietly keep our heads down, make no noise, make no waves, and hope it passes. But Torah and history tell us, when we stand on the side of justice and the side of saving life, God will be with us to watch us, to help us, to inspire us, and to guide us, so that our names might be preserved as were Shifra and Puah's. And so on this day of Sabbath, on this day of celebrating our relationship with God, my prayer for all of us is that we will recognize the vast power that we have in our own lives just by being decent people who advocate for the things that we pray for every Sunday, every Shabbat, every Sabbath. That we will recognize the vast power in our lives to extend kindness and love to each other, and that we will embrace our sacred covenant with God by being God's voices and God's hands in this world, and protecting those who would be scapegoated by others, and offering sanctuary to those who are living today in fear. May this be God's will as it is our own.